Apologies to the few Audubon folks that I know already saw this presentation in March, but maybe it'll really sink in the second time. My name is Patty Kelly. I am fortunate to work with a small but mighty crayfish, the Panama City Crayfish. So I work for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and we are tasked with administering the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which I'm sure everybody knows that that Richard Nixon signed the act, a Republican. I won't talk about politics because I'm not allowed, but I think that surprises a lot of people that this was a bipartisan supported act many years ago. But our mission is to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. And with the act, that we were given many tools to try to administer that mission. And it's still complicated, but we have good tools. And those include actually working with species before they're listed under the act. It's when we fail to do that, then it's actually listing the species, which is an arduous process. Then we move into the recovery planning process where documents are written and tasks are listed on how do we recover that species. But also we get to comment on projects when there's a federal nexus. We get to comment on projects that can help try to minimize the impacts to the species before that development or impact might occur. So what is the difference between crayfish, crawdad, crawfish, crayfish, crawdad, mudbugs, and yabbies? They're all the same, but yabbies are in Australia. So you'll hear that term more in Australia. I don't know why this crayfish was called crayfish instead of crawfish or crawdad, because crayfish is generally associated in the Northeast more than the South, but maybe they were trying to add a little sophistication to the South. But anyway, we got a positive article, be it crayfish or crawfish, it is now protected. It's been a long journey getting to that process, getting to that point, but taxonomic classification, very few people like that, but it is per canvas econfining, and that can confine a creek area, a watershed. So before I worked on this species, we definitely had real experts working on it, and that Horton Hobbs was a pretty incredible person who actually described 168 crayfish species. He has a really impressive career working on a lot of other species as well, but he actually named the Panama City Crayfish, and I don't remember now what date, but anyway, Paul Muller with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, they're our state agency and one of our closest partners. We're federal, they're state, we work hand in hand on species. When a species is federally listed or put on the federal list, it is automatically placed on the state list. But in reverse, they have a lot more species on the state list than we do in Florida for federal species. But many of you are aware of Dr. Ed and Lisa Kepner, local scientists in our community, and they really were the Panama City Crayfish's very first advocates. And our agency funded them to conduct the first full-blown surveys throughout the range of the species. And they wrote a lot of reports, and they've done a lot of other surveys for crayfish in the surrounding community that are in the same, I guess, peripheral parts of the crayfish range. So I had the fortune of getting involved with Panama City Crayfish because when I started at the agency 28 years ago, I was the new person on the block. And so that's how you get work, right? If nobody else wants to grab it, it's not necessarily our most charismatic species. I started my career with spotted owls and red cockaded woodpeckers, and then I'm given this not so necessarily charismatic crayfish. So it took a while before I realized once we manage the habitat and get prairie habitat coming back, then we can get sandhill cranes back in Bay County. So it's all about the birds. So why does the crayfish matter? So really, we for this species, and that's not always the case. Some species we really focus on the actual animal, but for this species, we focus a lot on land protection and managing it right and worrying about the hydrology, because this crayfish for the community, forget about the crayfish, but the lands that we need to recover this crayfish, they will hold flood waters for the community, filter the waters before it ends up in our bays, which we all know is very important for the community. a lot of the areas that we're getting protected, we're trying to write into almost every easement that it will allow 5% of impact for passive recreational trails for walking and maybe even minimal dirt bikes, not your electronic bikes. So we're trying to make it really inclusive of the community and how it can be used. And then, like I say, these habitats provide so much habitat for so many other species, not just the crayfish, but from the crayfish to sandhill cranes and everything in between. So it's a small critter. If you've seen it passed around, the largest ones get maybe to 2 inches. Most that we find are about 1 inch, and they do start reproducing at about 1 inch in size. The original historic range of the crayfish was about 56 square miles. If you can envision that burgundy circled area, pre-development, most of that habitat would have been occupied by crayfish. Most of the wetter areas, not your high, dry sandhill type habitat. And this is a good picture of the beautiful brown stripes in the back. But depending on the color of the water, that coloration will change significantly. This is just one of the better ones that show how pretty they actually can be. And this is the habitat. Still needs a little bit more management, but they're either found in areas that are called prairie or pine flatwoods habitat. The lower picture is actually our power lines. Some of the power lines throughout the range are some of our best habitat because of the way they mow them regularly, which emulates fire in the system. And then they also just spot spray for tree to keep the trees out of the area, which is the kind of habitat they like. With prairies and pine flatwoods, they're very low tree canopy density kind of habitat. They do need groundwater. We estimate, or the Kettners estimate, that they can survive if the water drops down to 3 feet. I get nervous when it gets that low because they're so little and they got to dig a burrow that deep. But that's what they estimate, that they can burrow down maybe down to 3 feet. We're not positive on that. We do know there's certain soil, core and secondary soils. The core soils are soil types that are more hydric, but not like deep standing water. The core soils, they can live in year round. The secondary soils are ones that are more saturated in years that we have higher rainfall. So that's going to ebb and flow a little bit. And you're getting closer to that 3 foot depth kind of thing. So combination of both work. So as the water table's coming up and down, that crayfish can move up and down in that interface. So, but the main thing too is when we manage habitats right, they really do require herbaceous ground cover, grassy herbaceous ground covers that can be pitcher plants, bog bushes, beautiful vegetation and high diversity when they're managed. And unfortunately, it's hard to get fire burning in the city here, but the mowing does pretty good. And we're working on it. We're increasing the diversity as each time that we're improving the management. So, complicated slide, but basically the species was identified by Hobbs in 1942. The state put it on their list for protection in 87. Kettner started surveys in 2000. I got involved in about 2000. We were petitioned by the Center for Biological Diversity in 2010. We had to do a whole lot of paperwork. We finally, we put it on the endangered species list with critical habitat protections and what's called a 4D rule. And we can talk about it later if you're interested. But anyway, the species was finally listed in 2022. But backtracking that pre-listing action that we really tried so hard not to list this crayfish. It's found in a part of one county in one state. Most likely it should not need listing, right? Why state laws, local laws. So we really worked hard with the state partners to try to not list the species for many, many years. We kept doing the surveys. We partnered with Bay County Conservancy, the Audubon. They only had wetland easements the easements were set aside just as wetland mitigation. And the Kettners discovered on some easements, we discovered on others that the crayfish were there. And they allowed us to start managing those properties. And so that was a great beginning of a partnership. An agreement was worked with the Florida Power and Light between us, the state, and the company. Because they, like I say, the lower left, that's beautiful habitat. Look at those flowers, and that's perfect crayfish habitat. And that's just from them mowing the habitat regularly. So we had one successful regulatory action that occurred before listing. Yes, there is a process to work with the agency and give them authorization for impacts before it's listed. And that's been pretty successful. But then we had a really hard failed attempt with St. Joe Company, and they're kind of key to the recovery of the species because they own the majority of the undeveloped area on the east side of the range of the species. But we're back at the table with them in talks about other processes to move forward. So we were petitioned in 2010. See, I kind of jumped ahead. But anyway, so I already said, why listed in one county, one species? The bottom line is we have to go through our listing factors when we're petitioned. It doesn't matter what the logic is or isn't, but when we go through our 5 factors, and that's looking at what are the impacts or threats to the species, and are they significant enough that the species warrants listing? And in this case, we said yes. The loss of habitat, we're about 50% less habitat than historically occurred. And the state's, to be honest and fair, the state's listing process was inadequate to protect the species. We saw very small protection actions occurring since the 80s and now. And so we determined that it warranted protection under federal law. The community did not embrace the listing. In fact, they fought it for years when it was state listed. And so a lot of pushback, mostly out of fear. So the fear is when you list a species, people think we stop projects. We never stop projects. I mean, rarely. Our job is to minimize the impacts to the project to the extent we can that's considered a reasonable amount of decrease of impacts. Even if it jeopardizes the continued existence, we then have to work with the applicant to come up with an alternative project that meets their purpose and need and does not jeopardize the species. And then if we can't do that, it gets elevated to, you probably heard the God Squad kind of thing. So that's never happened in my career since I've been working for the service for 28 years. So the developers were afraid. And I think now that it's been 3 years, I think some of that fear has been alleviated. So a weird thing, right before we finalized listing the package, Hurricane Michael hit our area. And we were then supposed to finalize listing 2 months later in January. But things got a little interesting. And I don't know if you guys know Josie Sear with Bay County and her boss, Keith Bryant, but they are phenomenal people and phenomenal partners. And often the county gets a bad rep because they have resisted listing this crayfish. But Josie called myself and my boss in at the time, and she said, what do we need to do to not list the species? Because they were afraid it would impede the recovery of the community. So we sat down with Josie and we said, there's 3 things we need. We need money for land. We need money to manage the habitat into perpetuity. And we need somebody to hold title to these parcels that might be purchased. So Josie, she's an engineer, but she took it upon herself to request $10 million from the governor's budget. She got $4 million. So at that time, we estimated $10 million would buy the 2,000 acres that we needed. She got 4, so that's a good start, a great start. And she also walked through the process of putting the lands under the Florida Forever project or Florida Forever program. In order to use state monies to buy land, the lands have to be registered under the Florida Forever program. And it's an arduous process, and she walked through it almost without any guidance. She had good consultants that helped her, and I'm very impressed by her help. Jump ahead. Money. So here it's about time to ditch the controversy. You know, some of the articles are pretty funny. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for providing us with $4 million so that we can do something about this stupid crayfish that probably never should have been discovered in the first place. So we can finally put this behind us. So just not a lot of support at the time. But anyway, so we were tasked with finding the money for endowment so that once we have 2,200 acres protected, we'd have money to manage in perpetuity. We did a deal with Department of Transportation. We authorized impacts on 600 acres of their road right-of-ways, and they wrote us a check for $3.5 million that's invested, and we can pull money from that money for land acquisition, management, monitoring, whatever we need. And that was a huge partnership. Also, it benefited them because they said we never want to see you again and talk about consultations, right? And we're like, deal. And a lot of the lands that they impact, were already kind of impacted already. They're not our optimal habitat. So it was really a good deal for both sides. But then we also needed somebody that would hold title to the land, and that's where the Bay County Conservancy and actually Audubon, they work hand in hand. Sometimes one owns the land, sometimes one owns the easement. It says checks and balance, but they work together and they've been great partners. As we're walking through the regulatory process, we get some lands protected. And we're like, do you want this 20-acre parcel? And they're like, we'll vote on it. And they so far appreciative. They've always voted yes. So we have other easements that are in the range of the crayfish owned by the state. St. Joe Development, Liberty Falls was the D.R. Horton properties, about 60 acres they have on East of Star Avenue. The Lynn Haven Bayou Park, you guys might know that, where the giant crayfish is, playground. And then the city of Panama City is our latest partners. They have 2 parks that we're working with them. A little bit of habitat, but it's pretty exciting. So we got a lot, but we didn't reach our goal. We didn't have enough money to buy the land. And we also, the St. Joe was not interested at that time in selling 2,000 acres of habitat. So we still had the list of species, but we got far towards recovery before we even listed it. And that was an impressive thing. So this is Sam. She's my sidekick. She's our recovery lead, official recovery lead. We divide it. I do consultation reviews, and she's our official recovery lead, but we work together on almost everything. But she's hiking in Colorado this week, so I'm flying solo. But so we're targeting about 7 population locations for the species, the big blue dots there. And some are small but powerful. Like number 1 it's really a ditch area and a little bit of leftover prairie habitat right beside the Shriners building off of 19th Street, I think. Yes. 19th. And we call it the baby maker because the railroad track that runs through there burns water longer than normal areas, and so they reproduce almost constantly. So that's where this little girl came from yesterday. So it's a small site, and but right now it's worth protecting as long as we can pull crayfish off of it to introduce them to other locations, or kind of mix the genetics up. But the genetic work, originally we worked with the University of Florida. They did an analysis for us. Originally they were like, well, there's an eastern-western divider, and then they decided not so much. They're just inbred everywhere because they become so fragmented. So pretty much he just said mix them up. So we're going to mix them up at some point. It's just a little scary doing it. So anyway, so the threats are land transitions, hydrological impacts, and then lack of management. So Sam wrote the recovery plan, and this is what she came up with, is that to reach recovery, we're going to have 5 solid populations. We'll probably work on 7, but 5 is the target. 2,200 acres in totality, and 4 populations actively managed, but we'll probably manage them all since we have the endowment. So our goals are actions needed. We need more land. We'll continue to monitor. We're doing that next month. Unfortunately, the best survey period is when it's hot outside. So if anybody wants to join us, Mark and Kennard, be glad to have the help. And augmentation, that's where we will start at some point mixing them to get those genetics less inbred. So we started discussions with St. Joe a couple of years ago. It's complicated with DEP's permitting, but if we could get a wetland mitigation bank set on St. Joe property to offset their wetland impacts for development, it's perfect habitat for crayfish. So if they get a bank developed, and we could recover the crayfish with that bank, the size that they're interested in. But we first have to convince DEP that it's a good idea. Anyway, here's the long list of partners we have: FAC, the City of Panama City, Bay County Conservancy, Audubon, Bay County Engineering, Florida Department of Transportation, Corps of Engineers, and Florida Power and Light. We are about 700 acres protected of land of our 2,200 acre goal. We have 100 that are in the works through the Florida Forever program, and the remainder of our $4 million that the county got for us. And that leaves about 1,400 acres to find, to purchase. This is complicated. This is kind of showing you the distribution. All the blue areas, those are where we have some protection happening. areas where we need more protection, but mostly we've got a little bit protected in all of these blue areas. So the distribution, if you understand conservation biology, when you spread it out, you can protect the species. So if a disease hits one population, maybe it won't hit the opposite side very quickly or that kind of thing. So we like to have it spread out, not all of our eggs in one big basket. And this is just to demonstrate how the regulatory process works, which is my favorite area of our agency, the program to work, which I know is weird because most people don't like it, but it is where we work with partners and consultants and developers to minimize impacts of habitat. And so far, since 2022, we've gotten 68 acres protected, trying to offset those impacts. And there's some odd pockets of beautiful habitat. The lower left, the Prison Prairie site is one of the best reference sites we have for this species. It is a beautiful prairie, and it became, that used to be a horse farm there. They just root raked all the shrubbery out of it, and this beautiful historic prairie just popped right back up. So it's pretty amazing. So our newest partner is the city of Panama City, and they, Dale Conwell, before he retired, he introduced everybody. We had been looking at maps to realize they have the right soils on 2 of their parks, and JD Mathis off of Florida Avenue and Joe Moody. And so we're working, we got permission with an agreement with them. We're gonna move crayfish to JD Mathis in the grass, unnatural areas, but we want to be able to watch them and try to learn a little bit about their behavior in an unnatural habitat. But the better the habitat, the harder it is to see the crayfish and watch them and understand what they're doing, and the harder to catch them. So in this area where it's completely altered, they can persist if the water's there. We want to try to see what their spacing might be. Hey there. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah, on the JD Mathis Park, I live on Florida Avenue.
Oh, okay.
Are y'all getting into the pond, the retention pond across the way?
We would not, well, we've looked at that. Actually, a lot of retention ponds are not ideal. So I didn't mention that when the water gets above about 12, 14 inches, the crayfish no longer would be in it because they're little, everything eats them, right? So you're gonna have bigger fish or amphiumas, it's kind of salamander that will eat them. But on that particular stormwater pond across from the park, there are some elevation changes and some beautiful grasses. We talked about it, so maybe, but we're gonna start on the park first, and then maybe we'll try that stormwater pond. Stormwater ponds are kind of a challenge because some are made with very fine sands where they bring it in, but more recently it seems like they're just using natural soils, and we think the natural soils ones will work if it doesn't get too inundated with water. So it's an idea. We're thinking about it. It's a good question. But it's,
sorry, there's one more question
okay.
Online. So other than Florida Forever, are there any funds to support private landowners that could conserve their land to help get the remaining 1,400 acres?
Good question. And it's one of the questions I put on the end. So maybe we can brainstorm on that at the end if we can. But good question. So with restore monies from the oil spill, yes, there's positives to oil spill. We get money. And there's my hand on the sign, right? I never have my face in pictures, just my hand, thankfully. But the kids right there by the school, what is the Deer Point Elementary? They helped design this playground, and it's been pretty popular and successful, I think. But challenges with recovery of a species, land acquisition is expensive, and even when you have the money, it's hard. It's the state, thankfully, handles the money end and the assessments and the appraisals and everything that has to go into it. It's been since Hurricane Michael, we got the money, I think a year later, and it's still taking us that long to spend $4 million. Trying to find sellers when they know you're interested, the prices might go up, but the appraisal does not, and the state cannot go very high above an appraised value. So that alone has been very challenging. Not only received for crayfish will be easily managed. Our limitations, we're in a highly developed area, but we'll have to settle for mowing if we have to, and hopefully that will work. Easements still belong to property owners. That requires a lot of contact, say, hey, we're ready to manage. And so every time we want to manage. So we really like the relationship with Bay County Conservancy and Audubon. We have a one-time agreement, and they just let us do what we need to do. And we appreciate that simplicity. Population, I think we already talked about this. We're continuing to monitor. We're always looking for land. And we're always looking for mitigation in our projects that we review. So I think all that we talked about. We get a lot of volunteers. We're dragging them out in the field because it is kind of fun. Because you don't just catch crayfish, you catch all kind of weird critters in the water. That's exciting. Elizabeth here in the lower left, I've known her since she was this tall, and she's now digging mud samples in the Louisiana Delta, because she interned with us for 1 year, and she's decided to study coastal ecology. So I'm pretty excited about that. Anyway, from a community that said we don't want this species protected, it has no purpose. The tides, I feel like I've turned, and I really credit the county for taking the initiative. Keith Bryant is Josie's boss, and he said the fear from the federal government is that if it's not protected, we can lose it because it's the only found in this one small area. It's not like other species that may be endangered that are spread out in other places across other states. And that's said by an engineer here, right? And he's heard all the negative stuff. So now we have a lot of partners. We're very much happy with that. We appreciate that. Paul Brent does a 4th grade art demonstration every year, and a couple years ago he picked the Panama City Crayfish as the exhibit, and it was really fascinating to see all the different kinds of artwork that the kids came up with. Here were some of our favorites that won awards. So anyway, I was asked to kind of engage you guys to help. How can you help us recover this crayfish, and knowing that it actually helps the community? And I do see people's yards as I drive around town, knowing there's probably crayfish in their yards, and wouldn't it be nice if I could just get them to protect that little prairie? But how do you incentivize someone to do that? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to fight the green grass, love that open yard kind of mentality. So this is where you guys have to start talking. Jessica.
So the Panama City crayfish depends on the soil, I believe, right? So just
Right.
because it's that kind of 12 inches or less water doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna be there. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay,
So usually though, the primary and secondary soils are the most common here, unless you think about the cemeteries. That's high and dry sandhills habitat. They're not gonna be there,
Okay.
right? But if your yard holds water, we call them ephemeral ponds, and it holds water less than 12 inches and then dries up, you could very easily probably have crayfish. So they need a certain amount of water there to breed and reproduce. We don't know, one of our limitations is how big does the baby crayfish have to be before it can burrow into the dam? So that pond has to stay probably moist enough for the little ones to be able to burrow. We know when they're born, they do hang with the female for a few days, but once they reach a certain size, the thought is that she will eat them if they don't disperse. So so we know they got to disperse pretty quickly, but how soon can they burrow is a good question. We don't know. Mark?
Yeah, you mentioned how good the site was near the prison after it was root raked. Did you introduce crayfish to that site after that, or were they already there?
They were already
Just-
there. Yeah, it
The
was
soil was good.
they were already there. The consultant said no crayfish there, and I was like, driven by that site is too beautiful, and we scooped them easily. It's got a few challenges. It's actually behind the prison. So behind the prison off Star Avenue, there's a wetland stringer, and then there's the ecotone, and that's where the crayfish are, and that's where the prairie is. And but there's also a pond, artificial pond, that we believe the developer's gonna plug it up. So one of my biggest fears, I loosely leave, is the hydrological changes that we have in our community. We gotta keep these sites holding enough water, not too wet, because other crayfish species move in that can dominate our crayfish, but not too dry either. So I envision at some point we might need some kind of water control structures, you engineers back there. So I envision that might be, as we have climate changing, heavy rains can be bad, and not enough rains could be bad also.
Got another problem though. Mosquitoes.
I know. That's a sensitive question, so.
The real question.
So mosquito spraying occurs in our community. They're in, they are, crayfish are likely sensitive to the spray. And, the thought is they're still persisting, even though we know the community has sprayed regularly. So for now, we are assuming and hoping that the spraying is not reaching enough inside the bigger pockets, because they are still there. And
The crayfish, I assume they still farm them over around Weewalt.
the crayfish, I'm not
Used to
sure.
grow over there.
That I did not know. I was not aware of that.
About 20 years ago, you could go over there and buy 20, 25 pounds.
Do you know what species?
No, it was originally from Louisiana, I know that, they started off there, and they did well.
And that invasive species like that, like, there's a lady at our office likes to have crawdad cookouts, we're like, please don't let any of the live ones go, because that would be a threat to the species. As big as they are, little crayfish eat each other, so they're opportunistic feeders, right? So they will eat each other. So that's a concern.
We've got a few questions online.
Okay.
So one is, have you worked with the UF IPTIS master gardeners or master naturalists to help spread the word about the need for property around Panama City? They could be trained to understand what criteria would be good for them to the landowners.
No, and actually, that's a great idea, because our agency also has an initiative to bring back pollinator plants for monarch butterflies that are, I think, proposed for listing. I don't think we finalized the listing, but it looks like we might list it. And so that is a huge encouragement, and that's a great idea that we partner with them to kind of accomplish both agendas. So yeah, appreciate that. That's a good advice. I actually know quite a few people that work with that program. So that's a good idea.
Another one is, I'm sure it's been considered, but similar to stormwater utility fees, has the thought about implementing a local fee on a development to go toward Panama City Crayfish Fund to create the endowment. Escambia County did that for Perdido Key Beach Mouse with great success. Samantha Pitts is the Escambia County contact for that work and included her email.
Yeah, so that project actually came about under a different permitting mechanism. It's a little complicated, but when you have a federal nexus, like if the course permit and a wetland fill, we do consultations in one way. For beach mice, there's not that federal nexus. So there's a permitting process for private landowners, which is how we structured that for beach mice. And that put the cost back to the landowner building a house in coastal habitat. And that is exactly what they did. And it's worked pretty well, but you have to think the cost for beach mice of buying coastal habitat is very high. And it has to be considered a reasonable charge. So if Norm wanted to build a house on a barrier island, he's gonna be charged this fee that does go into the same fund account for the mice that we have for crayfish. So they've been able to buy some small pockets of land, but it would take a lot of more charge to get as much land as we might need mice. So there's a lot of federal lands already. State land is protected for mice too. So I'm glad I don't work with beach mice. That's a lot more challenging than what we have with crayfish, because at least with crayfish in wetlands, a lot of wetlands are going to remain unfilled in because it's expensive to have to mitigate for wetland impacts, right? So you've had your hand in a couple times.
I get, what was the agreement that you put together with Sweet Pay? What was that all about?
They came us early on, and they could see the writing on the wall that most likely we were gonna have to protect the crayfish under the federal ESA. And they said, we don't want to stop development. Like, let's just say you've already started your development, we listed, boom, you gotta stop, go through the review permitting process with us. They just want to go ahead and cover it up front. And so we did that, and they really set aside what was left, because that was the old airport site that was already so altered. It was just kind of I appreciated the fact that they were forward thinking. And they're actually back at the table. They now want to They had a few small pockets left on their site. They agreed to manage it. They had a lot of suite of commitments to make, and they now want to offset that by buying. They're like, what else would you rather have than crayfish here? Because they're very small, isolated pockets. And so we're in discussions. There's a piece of land that's up for sale that we would like. They're looking at buying that, and then they'll be able to impact the rest that are on site. But it was just the fact that they came to the table very early, worried that they would have to stop, and they didn't, and it's worked out. Everybody's worked well with them, so.
So is it something like buying land somewhere else to support what's lost? in the
Yes.
development? Okay.
That's what they're back at the table to do. Initially, they just protected their areas and agreed to mow it, and that kind of thing. But now they're back at the table. They're gonna buy a parcel of land that we actually need by the Shriners, and then they'll be able to fill in the parcels. And you think about the cost, they could put several more houses on the property at the probably less cost of buying this 1.5 acre parcel that we're asking for. So it's a win-win. And that's what we really try to do, is how do we make this work for the developer? Because you think about, I know where I grew up, we had land to play and green space and that kind of thing. And we really like to say, if you're set aside these wetlands and let us manage it, it's gonna be more appealing for the kids in your neighborhood, instead of just having concrete, just having asphalt. If we can put boardwalks into wetland habitat, how fun would that be for little kids, right? So. And if we could connect them all, that's the dream I have. And I think the county is working on that with bike paths going through. If we could get them through power lines, just a nice bike path like they did the rails trails, the 3-mile section in Lynn Haven on the old railroads track. That's a great, well-used path right now. I see a lot of people using it. But it would be great if we could connect Harbors Park on the east side of the town. We're looking at buying land all around the animal shelter and the Lynn Haven Sports Complex. There's a lot of parking there. We're gonna have about 200 acres of land saved there. St. Joe already had easements in it. The county gave us an easement there, and we're buying land there. That's gonna be 200 acres where we could put paths. And the more we can connect all this, it'd be like Conservation Park on the beach is very popular. That's what we envision this crayfish doing for the community, is setting aside land so we can passively bird there, passively get exercise, and also have this crayfish persisting. That's kind of where we'd like to be. Anyway, so anybody here that has wetland in your yard, come see me.
Got 2 more comments online.
Okay,
Madison Barnes says, does the presence of mowers and machinery not disturb the crayfish within the habitat?
so we worry about that. What we asked with the county, they maintain the ditches. We ask they only mow when the ditches are dry. If they're mowing when they're wet, stay above the water line, and that way you're not blending up the crayfish. So if it's dry, they should be burrowed down, minimize compaction. We have seen some compaction actually helps hold water longer during times of drought. So we're not too concerned with some compaction. But we have worked at least with the county. We probably need to work with all the cities. We just haven't gotten to there yet, but that's a good question.
Joy Brown says, would it be okay if I shared the population status slide in our newsletter and let folks know that are interested in conserving their lands in those areas to contact Bay County Conservancy? Or do you have a flyer in regards to this topic I could add to our newsletter?
Yeah, absolutely, Joy. That'd be great. We can work on the slide. Yeah, let me know which slide you want. I can send it to you. I've got your email already. So let's communicate. That's great. I appreciate it. Anybody else?
Can you explain a little more about the water quality improvements question?
Yeah, so we know when we have wetlands and the waters sit in them before they filter out, maybe flow out to the bay. A lot of the not so good stuff in the wetlands, it's going to slow down, rush into the bay with maybe oils that have run off. And of course, we don't want oils in our wetlands with crayfish, right? But we know the more wetlands we have in our community, the less areas are going to flood, the more it's going to filter the bad stuff in the water before it hits the bays. And it's kind of part of the justification Josie used for getting the property that we're trying to push into the Florida Forever program was recognizing that I think it's Mill Bayou has water contamination issues. And that area that we're trying to protect land filters, eventually the waters end up in that Mill Bayou area. So if we can secure property that's no longer heavy agricultural and whatever stuff is put on the agricultural lands, maybe that can help improve the values there. Callaway Creek, I think some of the watershed, it's easy, at least adjacent, I'm not sure which way the water flows for that one, it could also benefit those two value areas. So,
Related question, you mentioned earlier that the crawfish help improve the water quality and the erosion. What do they contribute to the overall improvement in water quality? Is it, do they eat something that's contaminated? Is they're burrowing in the wetlands and that improves the filtration? How do they contribute? What's the mechanism?
to me, it's really just the land that they need to survive. Protection of that land is gonna protect and help have a habitat that can be filtering contaminants. So they themselves, maybe they're a little bit like mussels where they're filtering it, but I'm not sure we have any studies that prove it would be significant, but they are kind of taken in, but I don't think it would be enough. Really, what we're trying to say is the habitat protected will help indirectly improve potentially, but we know flooding is a big issue. And flooding happens when we just fill up everything, right? Water has to go somewhere. So the more we think about where we're going to fill in wetlands and trying to offset that, the better.
What about the stormwater management around areas of crayfish habitat? Are there any issues or problems with that in the areas that you're working?
Yeah, I wouldn't say issues. There's been some questions, like the county bought some land off of Jinx Avenue, adjacent Bay County and Audubon's property, the Talkington Reserve. They purchased, I think, 27 acres. They needed 4 acres for stormwater ponds, and then they donated the rest of that 20. So Bay County Conservancy and Audubon ended up with 20-some acres of land added to their already existing preserve. Where they put the stormwater control, there's been questions as to how they burned the road also. It was sort of, they widened Jinx Avenue, it burned the water. It might have altered the hydrology a little bit. But when we questioned the engineers about it, they didn't believe that what their actions were contributing. And I think later in time, I don't know if you guys know Phil Mountain, he's a stormwater engineer. I think he found that one of the culverts was plugged on another side. So their easements had started filling in with very deep water, and as we said, that can be dangerous for the crayfish. They look like a big pond. And so we had to check the culverts, and they were plugged up and had to be fixed. So we have to keep an eye and try to understand how the hydrology is affected, but I don't know. We've not noticed like stormwater ponds being a major issue. I would like to see where we could actually use them if we find certain ones that are not real deep. Some stormwater ponds are beautiful. Like there's a few now where there's a limpkin using it because the invasive snails moving in, but it's beautiful habitat, and the limpkins found it and they're persisting there, I guess. So yeah, so I think they're not all so bad. Jessica?
I have a list of projects areas for you. I can just email them, but
Okay.
when talking with the city, have you talked about 11 or Cincinnati and Lake at all?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
That does not ring a bell.
It's by the Boys and Girls Club. And then Sweet
Oh,
Bay is another location. Those are two that I've talked to them about, talking about Panama City Crayfish restoration specifically, but I don't know if it's appropriate for them. But
Okay.
Cincinnati and Lake will be a future stormwater area that you might have opportunity before they build it to work in some.
Is this where they bought out the houses?
Yes.
Yeah, I do think I've looked at that and think they have the right sort of those. So what I don't like is that they have drain holes. So.
Yeah, they're already, yeah.
So then we're just shooting them right to the bay, right? So but it might be worth exploring that we could maybe, yeah, that's a good idea. I'd love to at least talk about it. and try something, so we're open to trying anything. Kennard?
Can you say more about the, how you estimate the population size, the sweeps?
Oh, yeah.
And do you need volunteers for that? How does that work?
Yeah, so we paid for a consulting firm to help us trying to figure out not necessarily how many crayfish we have, but are our trends going up or down? So the stability of the population, because it's not a closed population. So we never feel like we're sampling the full, we can't sample all of them, right? So we have, what did I say, 30 sites that we monitor. And they said we need to sweep that wetland 81 times each time, you know, when the conditions are right. They're very specific. They're like, okay, when the rain gauge on the Apalachicola River is at this, when the water gauge is at this high, 8 days later, you need to go sample in that month, right? So they were very specific, which surprised me. So we do follow that protocol. Exactly. I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but the idea is that if we do that consistent, how many times we're netting and document what we caught during that time of scooping. So for I think it's 3 minutes no, we got rid of the time. We just have, okay, so we're doing 81 sweeps at a site, but if we have 4 people, then each person just sweeps 20 times, right? So the more people we have, the less you gotta scoop, the faster it goes. And that's just to be consistent in how we're sweeping the area and counting the crayfish. And that's just to give us the trend data, because we had a little small marker capture to try to have an idea, what is the density? And it really varied depending on not necessarily the size of the wetland, but the quality of the wetland. And so we found such a huge range. And we have some fancy numbers for that a PhD that used to work at our office calculated for us too. But I think it was like 6 per acre to almost 300 per acre might have been the number. So it's quite a range. And that's one of our challenges, is making sure they stay on landscape and that how much is enough for them, right? But we've got numbers that we're estimating. I think we estimate we need 5,000. And we calculated, that's how we came up with the 2,200 acres. How many numbers of crayfish do we need? How much time would it take? High quality, 2,200 acres should easily give us between 5,000 and 20,000 crayfish. So we've got math, but it's not perfect. It's a guidance anyway. Mark.
Trying to think, is there any discussion between you and the city with the proposed Robinson Bayou flood mitigation?
Yes.
That would be a lot of storm retention ponds or storm flooding alleviation ponds, which could impact the crayfish or benefit the crayfish potentially.
Right, so Mark's asking about, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the questions. You folks online can't hear everybody necessarily. Mark's asking about, there's a big restoration project in the city of Panama City, Robinson Bayou. And they're kind of going through the whole area, trying to improve the wetland filtration. So historically, we tended to dig bigger ditches to get water moving to the bayou faster, so it's not sitting in the community and flooding our homes. So I believe their agenda is to improve the wetlands and have more elevation instead of just a deep trench, right? They're gonna bring kind of like back the floodplain areas where the water would be spread out in a larger area and filter more, and then eventually drain to the bayou. I believe that's what their goal is. And I did go to the meeting, couple meetings in the field. There's a few spots that they're trying to integrate these small areas that we think will be the right ecotone for the crayfish. So they totally have been trying to integrate their project to improve or create a little bit of habitat for the crayfish. And when that happens, because they know where the right soil types are and the elevation, we're probably going to move crayfish to those sites if they're not there already. So yeah, they've been great thinking about that. But again, that was Dale. You know, Dale was, I think he's the one that got the money for that project. He's very environmentally oriented, and he brought us to the table for that before he retired. So that's been a great partnership so far. I haven't heard lately where they're at, if they're in the permitting phase, maybe with the Corps.
I think they're in the permitting phase. I was just wondering, they've contacted the Conservancy a lot about Doctor's Pond site. And it occurred to me just now as you were speaking that they never talked about crayfish when we were discussing how that contour done, and it would potentially be an excellent crayfish.
Yeah, so we met separately with Ashley and ERC. I was with the Loader Sample, but that they're the city's consulting, and they talked to us about trying to integrate that in with some pockets. So yeah, that's a pretty drastic. That's an ambitious project they're doing. I'm impressed, right?
Yes.
Like where they're making I think even creating a big moat and a bird island, or
Yes.
I mean, they got a lot of big ideas, so it'd be nice to see it actually come to fruition. But I've not heard, it's been about a year, I think, that we met.
During the permitting phase, we
It's
don't
a-
expect anything to happen during the permitting stage.
Right,
Oh, no, it's process.
but I think the money's there, so that's good.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, she said is it 1 minute or five? Five more minutes. Any more questions online? I'm plus. You guys have good questions. Thank you for listening, some of you again, the second time. And now I have anybody that wants to go out and scoop crayfish, let me know. I'll contact you in a couple of weeks. We're going out on the 28th, Kennard Mark. We've roped them in, we've got some shorebird projects going, and it's hard work, and we've roped them in a few times too, so. We definitely rely on volunteers a lot, especially now that our agency's budget has been reduced by 20%. I think our staff is down 20% in Florida alone, so that's it's great when we have people that help. Anyway, thanks everybody online. Appreciate it. Julie, I'll get back with you.
She can't talk.
Okay.
Everyone's muted. We had an issue once. No one's allowed to talk. Right, well, thank you. Bye.
Yeah,
watch your step. I know.
Yeah, back up and close this out. Alrighty, we've already kind of done that. So coming up, our next meeting is gonna be sea turtle conservation. In October, we're looking at longleaf pines, and then in November will be Lake Powell Community Alliance. So we do already have our lineup for autumn. So if you see anything else that you're interested in coming to, please join us. We do have a lot of goodies on the back over there. If you didn't get a chance to sign in on the way in, please do that on your way out. And we do have some time to mingle a little bit here at the end too. We've got until about 4:15. So then we got. Oh, also, we do have a race coming up next month. Our race for the bays. It'll be held at Conservation Park. It will benefit the estuary program and help us do some projects that we've been wanting to do. So if you run, if you like to walk, you want to volunteer, or you know anyone that might be interested in sponsoring, please let us know. And then we have flyers on the back for that as well.
That was really successful last year, wasn't it?
It was,
Yes.
yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Well, and now you have a 1K, a 5K and a 10K,
Yeah.
so there's something for everybody.
Yes, and we have a lot of runners registered for the 10K already.
Really?
Yeah, for a while it was 50-50, I'm like, whoa.
Some serious fun.
It's that came in my mind. Thank you guys so much.
I do the best,
Okay. I think it's kind of like.